Steve Brown, what do you think the end game for Scientology will look like? Some critics think it will retreat to Clearwater, closing and selling off all of the empty ideal orgs. Miscavige might follow the model of Hubbard and go into hiding to avoid criminal prosecution. Or he might use the money obtained by fraud to buy protection in a country where he can't be extradited. Your thoughts? I used to conjecture about this all the time, but I actually gave up on it because I realized that there are so many possible scenarios for what's going to happen to Scientology that conjecture on it is, you have to have information and hard factual information in order to make positive predictions or conclusions about something. And the things that we need information on in order to determine what's going to happen with Scientology in the future as an organization rely on data we don't have. We don't know the ins and outs of the corporate structure. How much control does David Miscavige have over the passwords to the bank accounts? Where are all the bank accounts? How much money is in them? Who can access them and who can't? How much power do the attorneys of Scientology have over that money? Were David Miscavige to be indicted or convicted of a crime or take off and go, absent, how much control would he still have over those things if he were wanted by the law? How much of a chance is there that the law is actually going to try to prosecute David Miscavige, right? These kinds of questions need hard answers before we'd really be able to know what's going to happen with the church. There are different models in history that you can look at as to what's happened with other cult groups that we could look at as possible scenarios, right? There have been small destructive cults that have just fizzled as soon as their leader died or passed on, right? That didn't happen when L. Ron Hubbard died. We have David Miscavige taking over, which is a lot like a man who took over if we look to the Jehovah's Witnesses as an example. There was a guy who started the Jehovah's Witnesses, sort of analogous to L. Ron Hubbard. He died. Another guy took over, very much like David Miscavige, very authoritarian, very dictatorial, and he took over for a while. And then when he died, the Jehovah's Witnesses did not just dissipate and blow off into the wind. A council of Jehovah's Witnesses took over, and they've been running the show for the last many decades. So that is a plausible scenario for what could happen to Scientology. Just because David Miscavige has a bunch of senior executives of Scientology, stuck on the ant base, relegated there under his thumb, well, if he disappears, I don't know what they're going to decide to do. They could just go, finally, and get out. But I don't think so. They're actually there because they're hardcore Scientologists. So some of them are going to want to step up and keep the thing going. Are they going to? Now, this is again where we lack information. Would any of them be in a position to step up and take power? Would the lawyers give them the power over the bank accounts, right? Because we are pretty certain that David Miscavige has no plan in place to turn over the mantle of power to somebody else. In fact, he's done away with or gotten rid of or declared suppressive every single person who was ever a challenge to his authority, right? So, could somebody step up and just take over? It's not just a matter of stepping up and telling all the Scientologists at an event, okay, I'm in charge now. This person's going to have the keys to the kingdom, right? They're going to need to have access to the bank accounts and have access to the money and the corporate power, right? So again, these are questions where we lack information about those exact matters, right? If there were a scenario where the government came in and Scientology started looking at, like if the leadership of Scientology did end up going to jail, and so the government moved in, or the FBI or something, and took over the assets, well, there'd probably be a bit of a fire sale, right, is one scenario, and then everything goes, and corporate Scientology's no more. That would be kind of interesting, but I don't really see that as a realistic possibility because, let's be blunt, right? Taking on Scientology legally has been a losing proposition almost universally, right? Because Scientology has the money and the will and the manpower to fight very, very hard on a legal front. And so there has not been successful prosecution of Scientology for criminal acts. I thought, if you look at the Lisa McPherson case, that's the closest they ever came to actually having somebody face real jail time. I mean, since Snow White, of course, since the 70s, right? The 70s were kind of, Hubbard's era. I'm talking about things in Miscavige's era, right? In the time that Miscavige has run the church, that's the closest he ever came to getting in very serious legal trouble, and they bought their way out of it. And they blackmailed or extorted or whatever they did with the medical examiner, and they did a whole bunch of hanky-panky and shredded evidence. I mean, Marty Rathbun has admitted as much in his blog and his materials. And he should know, he was the one doing the shredding, right? So they really dodged a bullet. And that, as far as I can tell from my knowledge of the history of Scientology, was the biggest bullet they ever had thrown their way. Because Lisa McPherson dying in their custody was a pretty big deal. So now you have various civil suits and legal suits and fraud suits that have been brought against the church, and one for one, they've been dismissed, thrown out, or in the case of the Rathbun's recent fraud case, or a harassment suit, which looked like it really had legs and was going to go somewhere, then suddenly the Rathbuns dropped it. Well, great, So that's the history of Scientology in the legal arena is not a history of great successful prosecution of Scientology, and I don't see any reason to think that that's going to change. So I don't think that legally I don't think a legal route is the way that Scientology is going to be taken down. It's a complicated matter. There's a lot to be said about it. It's not necessarily like I'm saying this because I'm happy about it. It's just how I see things. I think the way that Scientology is going to go down is the way that it's happening in front of us right now, which is through PR, through exposure. PR meaning not good public relations, but exposure of the truth on public media lines so that people see it for what it really is and don't want to have anything to do with it. And that does away with future membership and future money, right, and on a longer term basis. And that is where I see Scientology diminishing and diminishing and diminishing until it can no longer sustain itself. But that's a long way into the future. So that's about all I can really say in terms of how I've thought through where it's going. And I hope that gives everybody some food for thought and some ideas about what, some of the ideas I've had about it. I wish I could give a more definite answer, or I had a crystal ball about where it's going, but I really don't. So I and other critics have decided that our best way of dealing with this is to keep exposing the truth about Scientology in every possible way so that there's no question that this thing is a destructive cult and people should stay away from it. And that I think gives it a short-term longevity into the future.